In this episode, we're talking about ways to incorporate writing into our centers. Now, this is a great way for us to give our students extra practice with writing since we know that time is an issue when it comes to writing instruction. And I have the best guest on here to tell you how to do it, and that is Susan Jones. She has an amazing YouTube channel called Susan Jones Teaching, where she shares a lot of great tips around writing instruction as well as using centers in a first grade classroom. So I know that you're going to love this. Now, if you're not a first grade teacher, I still think that you can benefit from this interview because it'll give you a lot of great ideas for using centers even in the upper grades. And Susan just has such a passion for teaching students and teaching those foundations of writing that I really think comes through in this interview. So once you listen to the interview, make sure that you go over to YouTube and follow her at Susan Jones Teaching if you aren't already one of the 200,000 YouTube followers of hers, because she has so many great things to share from her classroom. So we're really excited to have you here, Susan. So can you tell me a little bit about what you're teaching this year and any details about that? Because I know you don't go back for a bit, but it's interesting to hear what you're doing this year.
Yeah, so I am very happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm teaching first grade this upcoming year. So I started teaching over a decade ago, and I taught first grade back in Las Vegas. That's where I started teaching. And then took some time off, subbed for a few years, and I am back to teaching first grade. Last year was my first year back in the classroom full time after a brief little hiatus and subbing and things like that. But next year, continuing first grade. It is the only grade I've ever taught, and it is my favorite grade to teach.
Yeah, first grade is the grade that I wanted to teach when I came out of my prep program, but then I ended up in fifth grade, which is so wildly different. And then after teaching for so long in upper elementary, when I went to actually watch first grade when my kids were in first grade, it just reminded me of how different that age is, but it's just so magical. Like those kids really want to learn. They're making so many gains. It's just such a great year. So I have not taught first, but I have a special place in my heart for it because it is such a fun year.
Yeah, the growth, especially literacy related, is huge from the beginning of the year to the end.
It's amazing. Yeah, I love first grade. So how would you say that your LETRS and your OrtonGillingham training influence your approach to teaching literacy as a first grade teacher?
Yeah, well, I've loved my LETRS training. I did LETRS first, and then I was OrtonGillingham trained through M.Ed. And the LETRS training was just so eye-opening for me. It really let me kind of pick which practices or see which practices I really needed to prune out of my teaching, as well as just giving me the insight to know that when I look at a curriculum, because many districts will provide you with one if you're lucky, but to be able to kind of look at it with a much more critical eye. So it really let me kind of fine tune and see what practices are really research-based and which ones I don't know where I've really developed over the years. You know what I mean? Like sometimes you get these habits that you think are good teaching, but maybe you weren't given the rationale. And so LETRS really helped me do that or get that rationale. And then OrtonGillingham was the next step I wanted to take in terms of just having more activities and application to using those practices. So I don't teach like specifically OrtonGillingham every day in my classroom, but again, I can take those practices and that knowledge and apply it to whatever curriculum I put in front of me. But I loved both of those.
I've heard so many great things about both of them. I did OrtonGillingham training earlier this year with my husband, which was really helpful because he's a high school teacher. And so he has no idea how learning to read works or learning to write works. And so it was really fun to see it from his perspective, but we took it together because my son has dyslexia and we knew we needed to help him. And we know OrtonGillingham is great for students with dyslexia. So we just, it did a little bit of the rationale, which I'm sure LETRS is way more in depth. But even learning that was eye-opening because we're both very natural readers and writers. We never had any struggles with it. We, went into kindergarten reading and writing just easily. So for us to understand, how it works to learn how to read and write from the beginning and the basics, and to understand a little bit more about what you can do for students with dyslexia was amazing for both of us. So I'm very grateful. And I hope that everybody gets some sort of training like that. And the only thing that I felt like was missing from the OrtonGillingham training was the writing piece. So we did go
Yeah.
over dictation a little bit, which of course dictation is very important. It's that bridge between reading and writing. But we talked a little bit about spelling patterns, but I know that MC it does a really good job of explaining some of that. But I've heard that letters goes way more in depth into writing.
Yeah, letters will definitely have it. It has like its own chapter on it, teaching the writing process and kind of dives deep into that, where the Orton-Gillingham is really that decoding and encoding and how they match up together.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing about the Orton-Gillingham training for me, there were two parts that that always just stick with me. The first one is the multisensory aspect for all of your students, not just your students that struggle to read. And then also just really understanding that, Orton-Gillingham approaches aren't only needed for students that struggle to read. Like when we teach all students that way, we are kind of lifting them up earlier. We're able to catch things earlier and not leave as big of a gap, which was just huge for me.
Exactly. And a lot of our strategies that work with our students with learning disabilities will work with our general population. So there's really no reason not to teach that way. And it's interesting because there are so many different types of reading programs, and not all of them have that multisensory approach, but it's something that teachers, I think, can really add on to whatever curriculum they have. So I think that's the benefit of it, is even if you have one that's a little lacking in that department, you can add it on. It will benefit all of your students.
Absolutely.
So what did you take from those trainings as far as incorporating writing into your centers? Or maybe even just talk a little bit about how your centers are set up to start, because I know people are always looking for ideas.
Yeah. So first of all, I loved the topic of this podcast in general, because when many teachers, especially in K-2, think about literacy centers, we're really talking about like phonics and word work, and those are so prevalent. And sometimes we can forget to add the writing in there. So in my literacy center's time in my classroom, I have about 30 minutes. And then based on how many students I have in my classroom, I usually do about 4 groups. I have a smaller classroom this year. So last year I had 18 students. This year I'm coming up on about 16, which I know is very small. So don't throw stones.
Amazing.
But I have done this same type of approach with a classroom of like 28. So I usually have 4 to 6 groups, depending on how many, students I have in my class that year. And many of the centers are going to be focused on decoding. But where I bring in the writing is I make sure I always have at least one, if I have 4 groups. And then if we have 6, then I have at least 2 specific writing centers. And those kind of change throughout the year based on what my students need. So when I'm thinking about writing in first grade, I know the first month of the year, one of the literacy centers is going to be handwriting. First grade, we are going over the first month of the year. We're talking about what those letters look like, hand formation, letter formation. So I'm definitely going to have a handwriting center, probably all of September. And then the biggest one that will probably last throughout most of the year is going to be an encoding center or a spelling center, which is really going to help students tie in what we're learning to decode. And so they'll have like a decoding center with, let's say we're learning digraphs. They'll have a decoding center, but they'll also have an encoding center specifically. So we can really make sure that I'm not just having students practice reading those words, but I'm also having them practice writing. And then so that's kind of like the first, I wouldn't say half of the year, but maybe the first like 3 months of the year that we're doing handwriting and encoding. Then I kind of phase out the handwriting center. The encoding one will stay all year and just develop as skills are added. We'll work on encoding different skills. And then what I really like to make sure I have students do is either practice some sort of syntax knowledge or a writing response. And those I'll kind of switch off each week depending on where we're at. And I actually think based on the trainings that I took, especially the letters training, the syntax part and spending more time on teaching sentence structure is something that I have changed tremendously in my classroom from when I started teaching a decade ago. So in terms of that for literacy centers, my favorite thing to do is going to be like a decodable sentence scramble. So students can actually mix up the words, figure out using their syntax knowledge where those words need to go in order, and then they rewrite that sentence. That's a very typical one that we will do. As the year progresses for syntax, we might have students writing words with specific adjectives, or I might have students combine sentences using conjunctions. So that would be like a syntax type center I would do. And then the last one that incorporates writing, which is one of my favorites because I feel like this is the one where you really get to see the most student growth throughout the year, is going to be a writing response. And that is the one that is the hardest for them. And it sounds very typical, but it basically, I like to do them like themed or seasonally. And I really don't do this in first grade until probably November, December, just because those first months of the year, we're like focusing on what a sentence is and things like that. So this is when I would just give students a writing response. I typically have them, instead of just a general prompt, I actually like to have them respond to reading. So I will have them watch a video on their iPad. It'll be either a read aloud video of a story, or I will have them watch, I think it's called SciShow Kids on YouTube. They have a channel and they're science-based videos. So they might watch like a 3-minute video on flamingos and then share like a fact or two that they've learned. So we're kind of incorporating that comprehension and a writing response type thing. So those are kind of what my centers look like for that writing portion throughout the year. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I absolutely love those. I think that you have a really good mix of the foundations, which are so important for first grade, with also still allowing them to have a little bit more of less directed writing, which, like you said, is really hard for them. So
yes,
for the kids that really struggle with writing towards the end of the year, when you do more of like that open response writing or response to reading, what do you do to support those students when it's their turn in that center?
Yeah, so when we have students respond to an open prompt, we have, a wide range of students who can do that, especially in first grade. So what I like to do is I like to make sure that all my students are responding to the same prompt and watching the same video. And then I just try to make sure I give them different access points to be able to share their knowledge. So what I've done is I've created a bunch of monthly writing prompts, and it's all the same prompt, but then the way that they respond might be a little different. So for example, some students might have a traceable sentence starter that they will just trace, and then they only have to write maybe 1 or 2 words. So like a fact I learned about flamingos is they'll trace all of that and then try their best to write 1 or 2 words. Other students might have a word bank at the bottom that they can choose some of those words to add to their response. And then some of my students who even by the end of the year still might struggle to get those words on paper, I allow them to use audio to respond using oral language. So we use Seesaw a lot at my school. In the past, if I didn't have Seesaw, I would just have them record like a little video of themselves or an audio recording, and they will go ahead and just share the answer that they have or the information they want. And when I'm listening back to that, I'm looking for, did they respond thoroughly? And then are they using complete sentences when they're responding? So I kind of have different ways they can go about accessing that.
Yeah, I think that lines up perfectly with the way that we modify activities as a part of direct writing instruction. So providing more scaffolds for certain kids is always really helpful, especially the first grade level when you have such a mix. We even mix at every level, but for the most part, as you get into upper grades, the majority of your kids can write a sentence. So with first grade, it's all over the place. So I think that
some of them don't even know all their letters. And I'm like, can you tell me everything you learned about XYZ?
Yeah, it's wild. So I think that's great to have that scaffolding, not only in direct writing instruction, but in center time. I think that's super important. And you were talking a little bit about kind of a looking at what they can do. So how do you assess with the literacy center? So I get the question a lot from teachers, which is, do I grade or assess what we do in the literacy centers? What do I use that information for?
Yeah. And to be honest, literacy centers time is difficult to do that because often, and at least for me, when we're doing literacy centers, I'm meeting with a small group, right? So I might not have my eyes on them all the time to be able to give that immediate feedback. So depending on what type of center they are doing, again, by letting that kind of differentiation unfold there is going to help, because for my lower groups, when they are doing an encoding or like a task card type thing, I'm going to make sure that the phonics skill they're working on is at their level. So when they get to that group, they might be working on a different set. It'll be the same encoding type activities, but it might be a different set of them. They might be working on CVC words instead of digraphs like many of the other groups. And that, even though I'm not going to go check on that individually, I know based on their, dictation and spelling tests that we've done throughout the week, that is where they're at, and they should be able to access that. In terms of other ones, like a sentence scramble type of activity, a syntax activity, whether it is paper and pencil, or sometimes I do those in Seesaw, I am checking them every day. It's sometimes by the end of the week, but I usually do check in every day because there's only 4 to 5 students in each group. And that way I can see it as soon as possible. If there's some sort of mistake, and I just pull them back either one-on-one, or if there's a small group of students, and I can reteach as needed type thing. And then depending if it's like a total flop, which doesn't happen often, but if I have like a group that just cannot access it, that tells me I need to either slow it down, I need to provide a scaffold, or they need a whole reteaching on that lesson. And then the writing journals for the writing response too. Like I said, that really helps me see the most growth students have had throughout the year in terms of spelling, but also just how they're doing with those sentences. Are they able to apply new skills, punctuation, capitalization, all of that?
Yeah, I think it's a great way to see where your students are without having to have any sort of formal test. Just being able to look and see what they can do in those centers when you have the time to look at them, and with the ones where it really works out that way. So I think that that's another great way to really address where their gaps are in writing, is to really look and see where they're struggling at it during the writing centers. So I think that that's great. And I think the only other question I think teachers are going to have is, what is the best way to juggle all the planning for this? Because obviously coming up with so many different centers every day and directly relating them to your lessons and also making modifications for different levels can be a lot.
Yes, absolutely. So what I try to find is, so this past year I had 4 groups. So I had 4 different stations, and those stations largely are going to stay the same throughout the year. What's going to change is just the skill. So for instance, I use task cards as one of the centers. There's a decoding portion and an encoding portion. And like I said, the activities that they're doing are basically the same. I teach them how to do it once, and then I just sub out the skill as we learn things and the year goes on. So that one's easy. When I do take out handwriting and I sub in some sort of syntax or decodable sentence scrambles, I do absolutely pull all my students over to the rug. We will go over explicitly how to complete it, what it looks like, and they will learn how to do that first. But then again, with a decodable sentence scramble, the objective is going to be the same. The skill just grows with them. And then also with the sentence scramble, I usually start off with like 4 words, and then they get longer and longer and more complex as the year goes on. But so I really try to keep the centers the same and just sub out, the skills that are there.
Yeah, I think that's key, not only for making sure that the students aren't trying to come over to you constantly to ask you how to do it, but to make sure that it's simple for you. Even swapping out those activities is a lot. But if you were to do completely different centers all the time, that I think would be a nightmare. So I like that you have everything very consistent and you have a really good routine with your students.
Yeah, and then the center itself stays the same for the entire week. So students will only do 1 center per day, is the way I have it set up. And I keep mine very short. I realize I didn't say that too. So we have 30 minutes, but they're actually only doing their center for 10 minutes. So they go to their center group, they will complete the activity. And then when they are done, they go to Seesaw and they'll do some sort of phonics activity there. And then they'll go to Epic, which is like a book reading. They can listen to audio or read along with it. So that's kind of how they spend that time. And then each day they move to a new center. So like the week, it stays for
That's a lot easier.
A lot easier, yeah.
I know there are some teachers who are trying to do 3 or 4 rotations just to get a lot of that. But I can see that just taking so much time. So I think 1 per week is good. So tell me a little bit about your YouTube channel, because I know you share a lot of great resources there, not just for centers, but kind of day in the life of a teacher. And I find it really interesting just watching your day in the life kind of videos and seeing the preparation and the work that goes into just setting everything up as a first grade teacher. And I specifically look for the writing ones, but I enjoy all of them.
Yeah. Well, thank you. YouTube is my baby. I absolutely love it. I started sharing, like many teachers, with a blog, about 10, more than 10 years ago. And just to kind of, what I found was keeping up with the times, I moved away from a blog to a video because I found it was actually easier for me to just sit down and just talk instead of typing everything out and formatting it all correctly. It was just, it felt more natural actually to weirdly sit in front of a camera and talk to nobody, but it did feel more natural. And once I started doing that, I started building a bigger and bigger community of teachers that were like me. And when I started my YouTube channel, my main goal was to share what I was learning when I was getting my master's or doing that LETRS training or my OrtonGillingham training, and just take little chunks of that, break it down into, 10, 15 minute long videos and share it with teachers so they could watch it on their own time. Because what I found was happening is, there's so much research and knowledge out there that's happening, and it's really hard to get it to teachers who are working full-time in a classroom. Not only are teachers usually not in on what PD they get, so they might not even have a choice in that, but also the time constraints of being able to do that are really difficult. So I was like, if somebody types in, encoding activities for first grade into Google, they might be able to find some quick and actionable ones that they can take and use in their classroom. And then as I transitioned back into the classroom last year, I didn't want to stop sharing with teachers. In fact, I wanted to share even more. So now I get to share all the stuff I did before and how I'm using it in the classroom, what's working, what's not working, and kind of ask for advice and talk it out with people too, which is just really fun.
Yeah, I think the community is so important. And that was one of the main reasons I decided to start this podcast, was because for a while, we were doing a lot of blogging, videos, podcasts, and I felt very connected. And then, for a while there, I didn't feel connected because we didn't have that. So that was a reason. And I think that YouTube is a great way to do that, because people get to see inside your classroom and they can really directly relate to that and get ideas quickly. And I think it's just a wonderful teaching tool, and it's essentially free professional development, but you can, like you said, you can pick and choose what topics you're interested in. So I love that you do that. Why don't you tell everybody where to find you on YouTube?
Yeah, my channel is Susan Jones Teaching. So type it in and you'll find me right away. I have over 400 videos now.
Yeah, if you put in anything about centers or writing or reading for first grade or kindergarten, you will see you come up. There's a video for everything. Yes, it's so funny because when I post videos and I look at the keywords, one of the keywords I always suggest is Susan Jones something.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah.
I know, it made me laugh. I'm like, oh, I know her. Well, thank you for what you do for teachers. I think that it's so cool that you show inside your classroom and you have some really great writing content. So I would encourage everybody, go check her out, Susan Jones Teaching on YouTube. Specifically look for writing, because I'm a little biased and I think that your writing videos are really helpful. Well, thank you so much for coming, Susan. I really appreciate it. And we will follow up with this conversation probably another time, because I know you have a lot more to share on writing.